Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. It turns out that the House is still divided. I mean, winning is easy, governing is harder. Turn with us now to those thrilling days of yesteryear, when out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's A-Push. History class rides again. We have three objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to describe the sources, goals, and compelling visions for Reconstruction. You should be able to characterize the economic, political, and social conditions of African Americans after the war, and you should be able to analyze the successes and failures of Reconstruction. But let's turn in Roman numeral number 15, which Dr. Foner has cleverly titled The Tocsin of Freedom. A tocsin is a type of a bell. It's a very clear style of bell, and this would be the ringing bell of freedom. And let's talk about freed slaves. For the former slaves, freedom meant family and education and political rights and an economic opportunity without the interference of others. And it turns out, I think those are common things for people today, too. One of the freedmen's most pressing goals was for land ownership. And you have to understand that slaves really had no opportunity to ever, own land or to pass it on to other generations, and never even earn wage from their work. So, the land is the source of the wages for a person in agriculture, and that was a slave's life, and we're really shut out of it for a long time. So one of the most pressing goals for the freedmen was for land ownership, and a lot of people considered freedom to be directly tied to the ability to own land, arguing that generations of forced labor had earned the rights to the land as unpaid income. Former slaves argued that they had the right to small pieces of the earth from their former plantation. After President Johnson's order restoring confiscated lands to the ex-Confederates, African Americans reacted angrily and fought pitched battles to go with plantation owners in some locations. But white landowners frequently prevailed. Even though black people were free, they don't suddenly have any more power in society. Well, only a small number of radical Republicans, people like Thaddeus Stevens, whom we met earlier, they believed in giving former slaves pieces of their former owners' estates. Congressmen, believing in the sanctity of legal title, suggested giving away land had been taken from Indian tribes instead and returning the plantations to their former owners to go restart the southern cotton industry. Only reality, a small portion of rural black people became landowners. Subpoint B. There was also the economics changed not only in land, but also in the way people earn incomes. Republicans wanted to restore cotton as the country's leading export, so they attempted to transform former slaves into new wage earners and wage workers on cotton plantations, but not independent farmers. They're still wage earners on somebody else's farm. Landowners wanted to retain the old gang labor system that existed in the slavery era, with wages replacing the food and clothing and shelter that slaves had once received. Landowners paid low wages for black agricultural work, leading to real major poverty on the side of the slaves. And it's not like slaves could just go get better jobs. There are no other better jobs. Black people fought back by organizing strikes, by seeing the work done by seeking work in the lumber mills and the turpentine and railroad camps and bargaining for better wages. The aftermath of the war hurt small white farmers, and by small white farmers, I mean farmers, of small farms, not like small farmers. But anyway, the aftermath of the war hurt small white farmers. A crop lien system developed, which used part of a farmer's crop as collateral for loans to the merchants and suppliers. So basically, a person would say, need to go buy seed and fertilizer from an agricultural supplier, but don't have the cash to do so. So they borrow it. They say, I'll take this up, and then once I sell this crop, then you can have the proceeds of the sale, a portion of the proceeds of the sale, and that way you can get paid back. And in the meantime, they're using the crop itself as the collateral to secure the loan. So that's called crop lien system. While farmers were able to increase cotton cultivation, it happened at the same time that cotton prices were plummeting, and they found themselves unable to pay back their loans. So the merchants go and seize the collateral that was used to secure the loan, which means the farmer now has done all the work of growing the stuff and has no crop to go share, to go sell for profit at all. Southern planters had to yield to demands to go pay field workers. Cotton planters, though, they lacked cash, and they offered to pay in the form of the share of the crop. So to go pay for the people that are farming, say, well, I don't actually have the cash to pay you, but you'll work now, and when we sell that, you'll get some of the proceeds of the sale from there. You'll share in the price of the crop. Sharecropping was a distinct labor system for cotton agriculture, in which the freedmen worked as tenant farmers. They traded their labor for the use of the land and house and implements. Sharecropping was an unequal relationship, though, since the sharecropper had no way of making it through the first growing season without borrowing money for food and supplies. I mean, you still got to buy food even though you're waiting for your crops to go to market. Storekeepers furnished the shopkeeper, share the sharecropper. That's a tough sentence. Storekeepers furnished the sharecropper with provisions, and they took a collateral on the lien of the crop. And as cotton prices were declining for sharecroppers as well during the 1870s, sharecroppers eventually fell into a condition of permanent debt. If the merchant was also the landowner, the debt became a pretext for slave labor, forced labor that kind of smells like slave labor. For ex-slaves, sharecropping was preferable to laboring for former owners, but it was devastating to Southern agriculture. It was just really tough on the market. It committed the South inflexibly to cotton because it was the only cash crop and limited Southern incentives for agricultural improvements. A rural economy emerged that was mired in widespread poverty and based on the uneasy compromise between landowners and laborers. Both black and white farmers found themselves caught in this system of sharecropping and crop lien systems. A far higher percentage, though, of black farmers than white farmers were renting land, and yet every census from 1880 to 1840 counted more white than black sharecroppers. This was a disastrous system for all sides. From 1868 to 1871, all Southern states met the congressional stipulations to rejoin the Union, and all of the states came back into the fold. Reconstruction governments were ambitious, and they established reforms in things like education or family law or social services or commerce and transportation. Republicans in the South, they needed the African American vote to go win office, and they helped to organize organizations like the Union League, a biracial fraternal order. Now, it was a secret fraternal order because it's still socially dangerous, but it functioned as a powerful political club to go uphold justice to freedmen. Southern Republican governments established the South's first state-supported public schools and pioneered civil rights legislation. Republican governments took steps to strengthen the position of rural laborers and to promote the South's economic recovery. And the Freedmen's Bureau, which we met last class, the Freedmen's Bureau helped freedmen on economic matters and established schools for African Americans, including black colleges like Fisk and Tougaloo and Hampton Institute. By 1869, there were over 3,000 teachers, half of whom were black, instructing freedmen in the South. And this is where I want to introduce two new words for you: carpetbaggers and scalawags. They're both fun words to say. Carpetbaggers were northern-born white Republicans who held political office in the South. So the people that lived in the North but moved to the South, the Republicans, and they go campaign for office, all of these new black voters, they were all voting Republican, and it made it possible for Republicans to win in the South. There weren't many Republicans there, like native-born, but white ones moved from the North into the South, and they become known as carpetbaggers. They're named for their small suitcases. Carpetbaggers had the reputation as outsiders who swept in to exploit the war-weakened South. Now, on the other hand, you have Southern-born white Republicans, and they're called scalawags by Democratic ex-Confederates. They're not carpetbaggers because they're not like moving in and still carrying their, like Mary Poppins had a carpet bag. They're not like carrying their luggage with them, but they're scalawags, and they helped swing some state and local elections for Republicans. Some were wealthy, but most were upcountry non-slaveholders before the Civil War, and some even had been Unionists during the war. Both scalawags and carpetbaggers wanted to bring northern capital to the South for economic growth and for personal gain. And here I want to introduce the idea of the black office holder. You know, African Americans were totally shut out of the political life, not just for voting, but the ability to hold office before the Civil War. But suddenly the promises of voting and citizenship opens up a political office to black people as well. And 2,000 African Americans occupied offices during Reconstruction. 14 even elected to the United States House of Representatives, and 2 to the United States Senate, making it all the way to the upper chamber. The majority of state and local black office holders were former slaves. But contrary to the Southern Democrats' perception of black politicians as ignorant field hands, many were skilled and educated. They'd achieved some economic success and were accomplished reformers. Northern black ministers and teachers and Union veterans, they also moved south to go help in Reconstruction. Though they were never proportionate to their population, black office holders were prominent in the South. The presence of a person holding a political office and being black and the white allies, they made a real difference in Southern life, notably receiving fair trials in the court systems and fair treatment in local government. Subpoint D, Republicans modernized the state constitutions as well. It's not like the old Southern Constitution, like the old pre-Confederate Constitution suddenly, well, just blow the dust off the Constitution and go back in it. No, they're new modern state constitutions, and they're largely written by the Republicans who were bringing those states back in. And they eliminated property qualifications for voting. They abolished the black codes, which were, essentially renamed slavery, and expanded the rights of married women as well. Reconstruction and social programs called for new hospitals to be built and new humane penitentiaries and jails and asylums. One flawed development, though, was the adoption of convict leasing, allowing private companies to go hire prisoners as laborers. The system was riddled with corruption, and prisoners worked in horrible conditions, and the thing kind of smelled like slavery again. Most impressive of Republican Reconstruction government achievements was in the field of education. By 1875, over half of all black children were attending school in several deep Southern states. White children also benefited from higher education rates during this progressive period of Southern education. Every state helped finance railroad construction. The states said that the railroads are really the future of how the economy is going to grow, and they saw it as the key to economic development in the region. But in reality, economic development was weak. The South would continue to languish in its economic growth as investment opportunities in the West lured more investors than Southern investors. And just overall, the South really never emerged as a strong economy. I we shouldn't say never, but it kind of didn't really emerge as a strong economy. Subpoint E. After emancipation, Southern African Americans could engage in open community building. Doing so, they cooperated with Northern missionaries and teachers. Churches quickly became institutions of black life. Black churches served as schools and social centers and meeting halls. Ministers were community leaders and political spokesmen. Teachers and charity leaders embarked on a project of racial uplift, and black entrepreneurs built businesses that centered largely on a black clientele. Some black leaders promoted the integration of public facilities, but most stayed away from the issue. Many black parents preferred all black schools to protect from hostile whites, so while integration might be an ideal in a future generation, right here in these tender years after the Civil War, segregation seemed safer, even for black people. I want to take a minute to talk about Southern black women during Reconstruction, where a major conflict raged between employers and freed people over this question over women going to work. While planters demanded that freed women go back into the fields, black people resisted resolutely. For African American women, emancipation increased subordination within the black family. Some black women, though, headed their own households. Many freed people, and the opportunity for a stable family was one of the real successes of post-Civil War life. Many African American families accepted the Northern ideal of domesticity. Women attempted to remain in the home and devote themselves to motherhood, while men were urged to work diligently and go support their families. At the national level, in 1870, Congress addressed the desegregation with the Civil Rights Bill, championed by radical Republican Charles Sumner. By the time it actually passed in 1875, it was a narrower version. It required full and equal access to things like jury service and to transportation and public accommodations, regardless of a person's race. Near another century would pass before Congress would pass the Civil Rights Act of 1965, which would really put much more teeth into guaranteeing access to civil rights for African Americans. Roman numeral number 16. Corruption existed during Reconstruction. It was ripe with all of that money suddenly flowing in. The constant movement of money is just going to attract corruption, and it fed right into opponents of Reconstruction ideas. But it's also worth knowing that the corruption of Reconstruction wasn't confined to any particular race of person or region of the country or political party. Basically, the rapidly expanding state budgets, it was just a honeypot worth taking, and it was ripe for influence and bribery and insider dealing and a get-rich-quick atmosphere. Scandals in Republican administration of President Ulysses S. Grant, it eroded public confidence in Grant's policies, particularly during his second term of office. Democrats, we mostly associate the corruption of this era with New York's Tweed ring of Boss Tweed in New York City, which heavily defrauded Southern government for millions of dollars along the way. Republican presence in the South led to more organized opposition and violence, and secret societies sprang up throughout the South with the aim of preventing black people from voting and from destroying the organization efforts of the Republican Party. The most notable of these groups is the Ku Klux Klan, which first appeared in Tennessee in 1866. It appeared under Nathan Bedford Forrest, a fiery secessionist and white supremacist. It launched what one victim called a reign of terror against Republican leaders, regardless of the person's race. By 1870, the Ku Klux Klan was operating almost everywhere in the South as an armed force whose terrorist tactics served to reinstate governments under the control of the Democratic Party and to try to terminate Republican Reconstruction programs. Congress and President Grant, with the passage of 3 different enforcement acts in 1870 and 1871, he successfully put an end to the Ku Klux Klan in 1870, and Grant more or less kills the Klan of its time. Don't worry, it'll be back, but a kind of a different one. Prosecuting Klansmen was an uphill battle for U.S. attorneys. They usually faced all-white juries, and they lacked the resources to handle the cases. After 1872, prosecutions began to drop off, and a lot of Klansmen received hasty pardons. Subpoint B. Some Republicans were alienated by Grant's corruption and his administration, and they broke away to form a splinter group of the Republican Party known as the Liberal Republican Party. And there they nominated in 1872 a challenger to Grant for president, a guy named Horace Greeley. Greeley was a longtime publisher of the New York Tribune and had a certain amount of cachet, particularly in the North. Classical liberal Republicans, they broke away from the Republican Party to form, I just said that sentence, the Liberal Republican Party. They often claimed that power in the South should be returned to the region's natural leaders. And boy, that's a loaded statement of return to the natural leaders. Who are the natural leaders in the South? Exactly, liberal Republicans. They denounced universal suffrage, saying that, you shouldn't just have wide open rights to vote, and decried that black people were ultimately unfit to govern. And they turned Northern public opinion against Reconstruction. Now, Ulysses S. Grant, he easily defeated Horace Greeley, who ran for both the Liberal Republican and Democratic parties at the same time. So Greeley appeared on both tickets in 1872, and Grant won 50% of the popular vote and every electoral vote. Scandals during Grant's second administration, such as the Credit Mobilier and the Whiskey Ring, further eroded public confidence in government and confirmed the liberals' argument that it just didn't seem like the old method was going to work anymore. Subpoint C. The events of the 1870s, as well as racist media reports, they deepened the Northern white disinterest in Southern black issues, particularly after 1874 when Charles Sumner died. He was kind of like the last great piece of the radical Republicans. When he died in 1874, with him kind of died that pillar of the party. Liberal attacks on Reconstruction contributed to a resurgence of racism in the North, as well as books and newspapers and art depicting corruption in South Carolina, blaming black politicians for the whole thing. Although constitutional amendments and federal laws protected civil rights, though those things remained in force, the Supreme Court decisions, piece by piece, began to weaken those efforts. The Supreme Court whittled away at Congress's guarantees of black rights, deciding cases that limited how well Washington, D.C. could enforce civil rights protections in the states. By the mid-1870s, Reconstruction was losing favor in the South, and Democrats began to win back elections. Those Democrats called themselves redeemers, having redeemed the white South from the corruption and mismanagement of Northern and black control. In states where Reconstruction governments survived, violence erupted in broad daylight, which, unlike Klan violence, happened at night in disguise. No, now that there's no protections against it, the violence was just wide out in the open. Fearless white supremacists joined groups called rifle clubs, and they harassed Republicans at rallies, and in later conflicts just shot dozens of black people. Grant refused to provide federal help to go stop that violence, saying that Northerners were just tired of solving Southern problems. On election days, Democrats destroyed ballot boxes and prevented former slaves from voting, and the result was landslide victories for Democrats in the South. The Republicans' hopes for economic growth, they ended with the sudden economic depression in 1873. That depression discredited the Republicans. They resulted in plunging, crop prices and created massive unemployment. The Southern economy came to a screeching halt, and public credit collapsed around them as public spending and private investment in the South for reform efforts like the Freedmen's Bureau were just suddenly decreasing all at once. The economic crisis also revealed widespread corruption among Republicans and Southern Democrats alike. The collapse of the Freedmen's Savings Trust Company and the Republican-controlled congressional refusal, and Congress, which was controlled by Republicans, they refused to go step in. It signaled that Reconstruction was losing its moral leadership, and the work of Reconstruction was kind of petering out by the mid-1870s. Subpoint D. The undoing of Reconstruction was as much about Southern resistance as Northern acquiescence. Most white Southerners believed that Reconstruction governments were illegitimate regimes that didn't really deserve to exist. Democrats worked hard to get the vote restored to ex-Confederates and violently attacked Republicans and black political leaders in an undemocratic and unviolent process they called redemption. Republican governments that were denied federal help found themselves overwhelmed by the massive resistance of their ex-Confederate enemies. Between 1873 and 1875, Democrats overthrew Republican governments in Texas and Alabama and Arkansas, and voters reacted by handing Republicans stunning defeats and turning the Democrats into a major party during the 1874 congressional election. Republicans had lost control over the South. It was evident in Mississippi when armed local Democrats paraded in stuffed ballot boxes, taking control of the states in 1875. By 1876, Republican governments remained only in Louisiana and South Carolina and Florida. Elsewhere, the former Confederates were back in control. And that brings us to subpoint E, the political crisis and disputed election and the corrupt bargain of 1877. Republicans that year in 1876 nominated Rutherford B. Hayes as their presidential candidate. He and his Democratic opponent was a guy named Samuel Tilden, and both of them favored home rule for the South and basically giving up on the Reconstruction protections. The election was very, very close, and with disputed electoral votes in states like Louisiana and South Carolina and Florida, and it wasn't really sure who actually won those states. In order to settle the disputed election, Congress set up a special electoral commission to determine the winner of the disputed votes. Behind the scenes, Rutherford B. Hayes made a bargain to allow Southern white Democrats to control the South if his election was accepted. Rutherford B. Hayes will go take office and essentially end Reconstruction, and the South could go have their own states back in exchange for him winning the White House. As a result of this compromise, the commission awarded the disputed votes to Rutherford B. Hayes by a vote of 8-7, and the Democrats had control of the South. Subpoint F. Although Reconstruction officially ended in 1877, in some states black people continued to vote and even continued to hold office until through the 1890s. But overall, the era of Republican control and easy black voting in the South, it was over. In the short run, the political effects of 1877, it had very little effect on the lives of most Southerners. The slow decline of radical Republican power and the rise of the Confederacy and Southern Democratic power exerted the most impact on Southerners. Although Southern whites used the violence to put down black aspirations of political power, they could not return the South to the old antebellum reality of slavery. Reconstruction had shaken the entire legal framework that justified the United States as a white man's country. The 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment existed. They were the legal basis of the 20th century legal rights movement, the civil rights movement. So while in the short run, nothing really changes, in the long run, the genie is out of the bottle. Reconstruction, though, ultimately failed because it didn't prevent the widespread poverty and denial of rights for African Americans. The South may have lost the war, but it controlled the construction in the nation's memory. And Reconstruction, it ignored the vigilante violence and describing radical Republicans and black activists as corrupt and ignorant. And there's an old phrase that says that the North might have won the war, but the South won the peace because they controlled the narrative for there and forever after, and a fascinating story that I can't wait to tell you about. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.